This is lecture recording for Lecture 7, Endocrine System. The endocrine system is made up of a group of ductless glands that release their secretion into the circulatory system. So whether that is blood or the lymph. Okay. And because they release their products into circulatory system, that is what defines them as endocrine. Okay. So this is opposed to exocrine glands, which release their secretion into ducts. The molecules released by endocrine glands are known as hormones. So hormones are messenger molecules that are able to travel through blood or lymph to oftentimes a distant site, where they are able to act on that distant site and lead to a certain physiological action. Depending on the specific endocrine gland, the effect can be either metabolic rate, it could have an effect on growth, on the reproductive system, on how our body handles stress, okay, and more. Okay, and that's something we're going to discuss through this lecture, what each of those endocrine organs are capable of doing. And because hormones travel through blood or lymph to get to their target site, in such a way they are able to have a much more widespread of effects compared to the nervous system, where oftentimes you get the signal coming from one, but only able to have more of a narrower effect. Okay. So compared to the nervous system, where the responses are faster and more specific, the endocrine system are generally, their speed of action is generally slower, but they're able to have a widespread, I don't know why I keep saying widespread effect. They're able to carry out more widespread effect. The lecture note will talk about the different types of endocrine glands, which ones are pure and which one have a mix. There is no need to memorize that list. Okay. It's important to realize that endocrine glands are generally very richly vascularized. Okay. And they're located in various parts of our body. The basic hormone action is such that they travel through blood vessels, sometimes lymphatic vessels, but mostly blood vessels, to get to their site of action. And they can reach anywhere that blood can reach. So that means the same hormone that's released by a single endocrine organ can concurrently have various effects on different organs. Okay, so that's what makes it such a widespread effect. There are generally 3 types of stimulus that can cause an endocrine gland to release its hormone. So there's humoral stimulus, neurostimulus, and hormonal stimulus. The humoral stimulus is where the alteration of a certain chemical in blood causes release of hormone from the endocrine gland. And this is an example, is the parathyroid hormone. When there is a drop in blood calcium level, that triggers the PTH, or the parathyroid hormone, to be released from the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands then are going to go act on the bones, on the kidney, on the digestive tract, and causes increased calcium. So those details are things you're going to learn in physiology. Now the second type of stimulus is called neurostimulus, and this type of stimulus is a result of neuron, stimulating that gland, triggering it. Okay, that nerve impulse triggers that gland to release hormones. Okay, so an example shown here are those sympathetic input causing the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. The third type of stimulus, the hormone stimulus, is where one endocrine gland secretes a hormone that travels and then acts on another endocrine gland, okay, causing that second endocrine gland to release hormones. So the hormones that are able to act on another endocrine gland is called a tropic hormone. Okay. So later in this lecture, we'll talk about tropic hormones. Now we're going to go through the main endocrine organs in our body, starting from the head and going downward. The pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis, and its name means the undergrowth. It's situated inferior to the brain in the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica. You recall the sella turcica, which means the Turkish saddle. You may have just learned that bony landmark in lab. Okay, so it's that part of the sphenoid bone that holds the pituitary gland. There are two parts to the pituitary gland. There's the anterior pituitary, also known as adenohypophysis, and then there is posterior pituitary, also known as neurohypophysis. And the anterior pituitary is an endocrine gland of epithelial tissue, whereas the posterior pituitary is considered an extension of neural tissue. And you can see by their alternative names. Okay. So adeno is referring to the glandular, the endocrine gland part. And neuro is referring to the neural tissue of that part of the pituitary. Okay. So really your pituitary gland is considered a neuroendocrine tissue. Now we're going to first look at anterior pituitary. Adenohypophysis. Your anterior pituitary secretes these major hormones, and how you can remember that is by this mnemonic device, flat pig. Okay, just look at this piggy, cute piggy. And that, what that stands for is, the F stands for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH for luteinizing hormone, ACTH for adrenal corticotropic hormone. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. The P is for prolactin. Okay. The GH for growth hormone. Okay. The I doesn't really stand for anything. Your lecture note also mentions a hormone called the melanocyte stimulating hormone. That one you don't have to worry about. The first four, flat. Okay. These four hormones are tropic hormones. Remember what tropic means. Tropic hormones are hormones that act on another endocrine gland. So they are hormones that are secreted by an endocrine gland, and they travel through blood to another endocrine gland, causing that second endocrine gland to secrete hormones. So hormones causing secretion of hormones. Okay, so this image just illustrates that concept. That's all there is to tropic hormone. I mean, not all there is, but that's what it means. As simple as that. Okay. In this image, you can see the respective site of action for each of those tropic hormones. Okay, so first we have the ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. This first hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary travels through blood and then acts on the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, okay, so the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. This is something we're going to look more closely at later. but the cortex is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. So the ACTH binds to the adrenal cortex and causes the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. And then there's a different corticosteroids, which we'll look at later. But all those corticosteroids function to help our body cope with different types of stresses. The TSH, the second hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. As its name implies, it travels through blood and then binds to the thyroid. It stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone, in turn, is able to control your metabolic rate. Gonadotropins are hormones that act on the gonads secretion, causing a change in the secretion of the gonads. Let me rephrase that, sorry. The gonadotropins are tropic hormones that travel through blood to the gonads and then causes the gonads to release more of these hormones, the sex hormones. Okay. So those gonadotropins, namely the luteinizing hormone LH and follicle stimulating hormone FSH. So these two are known as gonadotropins. Okay. They're released by the anterior pituitary. They travel through blood to get to the testes in men, ovaries in women, and causes release of these sex hormones. Okay. These sex hormones, in turn, have an effect on the maturation of the sex cells. Finally, these two, the prolactin and growth hormone, these two, they are also secreted by the anterior pituitary. But why are these not considered tropic hormones? Well, it's because, as you can see, prolactin and growth hormone, they act directly at that target site, and instead of causing release of another endocrine, another hormone, they simply, for one, they stimulate bone growth, the other stimulates the milk production. Okay, so they don't cause release of another hormone. For that fact, they are not considered tropic hormones. This slide goes over a few of the alternative names for these hormones. Luteinizing hormone, also known as blutropin. Okay, the tropin here, okay, is all referring to the fact that these are tropic hormones. ACTH, also known as corticotropin, because it acts on the adrenal cortex, causing release of corticosteroids. Thyrotropin acts on the thyroid. Okay, so it's a tropic hormone that acts on the thyroid, causing release of thyroid hormone. Okay. It's important to understand the difference between tropic versus trophic. Tropic hormone, they cause secretion of hormone from other endocrine glands. So this is something we've discussed a few times in this lecture now. Trophic hormones, they cause growth on the tissue that it is stimulating. So some examples are TSH and ACTH. TSH causes the thyroid to enlarge in its size and the number of cells. ACTH has similar effect on the adrenal cortex. So as you can see, a hormone can be both tropic and trophic at the same time. Okay, but being one doesn't necessarily mean that it's also the other. Now let's talk about how the hypothalamus controls release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Your hypothalamus releases releasing hormones, RH, and inhibiting hormones, IH. These travel through capillaries that connect the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. And it gets to anterior pituitary and causes anterior pituitary to release more or less of its hormones to the systemic target organs. So in that sense, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are also considered tropic hormones, okay? Because they have an effect on another target organ, on another target endocrine organ. Well, okay, so here's a question. Which structure secretes releasing hormones? Okay. The answer is hypothalamus. Releasing hormones, by definition, are hormones secreted by hypothalamus that travel to anterior pituitary and then causes increase of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Here it is. So there are different distinct releasing and inhibiting hormones for almost every anterior pituitary hormone. Okay. The CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, stimulates ACTH release from the anterior pituitary. Okay, and then these ones, I don't need you to know them right now because you're going to study them in physiology. But just know that the hypothalamus secretes releasing hormone and inhibiting hormone. And releasing hormone causes anterior pituitary to ramp up its secretion of hormones, okay, of that specific hormone. Whereas inhibiting hormones are gonna reduce the amount of hormone that's secreted by the anterior pituitary. So be able to name the tropic hormones in the list of options. Understand which hormones are secreted by what gland. The TRH is a releasing hormone, as indicated by its name, releasing hormone. And it's secreted by the hypothalamus. TSH, also known as thyrotropin, and it's secreted by the anterior pituitary. So this stimulates release of this from the anterior pituitary. And then this travels to blood to get to thyroid and causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Now let's take a closer look at the hypothalamic control of your adrenal hypophysis. Your hypothalamic neurons, so this is your hypothalamus. It's situated superior to the pituitary gland. This is where those there are neurons here that synthesize releasing hormone and inhibiting hormones, and those hormones then get released into this hypophyseal portal veins. Okay, they travel to the anterior pituitary and causes release of hormones in the anterior pituitary. Okay. And then this is where the anterior pituitary releases its hormones, the flat pig, into the general circulation. This is just another schematic. Yet another schematic. The posterior pituitary. Okay, now the posterior pituitary just only secretes two major hormones. One is the ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And its name tells you that it has an effect on blood pressure. Okay, and that's in fact the case. ADH causes increased water reabsorption from the kidneys. So when you are retaining more water in your blood vessels, that raises your blood pressure, but also dilutes your blood concentration. Oxytocin is a hormone also secreted by the posterior pituitary or your neurohypophysis. It signals the smooth muscles in a woman's or a pregnant woman's uterine wall and cause a contraction. And that's what causes contraction of the uterine wall during childbirth. Okay. It also is responsible for the milk letdown reflex, which is the ejection of the milk. So not the production of milk, but the ejection of the milk in response to the infant suckling. Now let's talk about how the hypothalamus is able to control hormone release from the posterior pituitary. So as you can see, the mechanism is going to be slightly different, or quite different from what we see for the adrenal hypothesis. Here we see that oxytocin and ADH are actually made not in posterior pituitary. They're actually made inside hypothalamus. Okay, so they're made inside these neurons, and then they're transported down the axon of these neurons through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary. Okay, this is where they get stored in those nerve endings, known as axon terminals. Okay, and when these neurons are triggered to fire, that nerve impulse travels down the length of the axon and causes the nerve endings to release oxytocin or ADH, depending on which neurons are triggered. Okay, so then they're then released into the capillaries here. Okay, then they're able to travel into the general circulation, into other places in the body. Okay, it's important to know that the posterior pituitary does not make hormones. It simply stores a hormone that's being made in the hypothalamus. So as you can see, this is why the posterior pituitary is considered a neural tissue, as opposed to simply a glandular tissue that we see for anterior pituitary. Just another schematic showing the same thing. Okay, so in this question, which of the following is unlike the others? The reason is oxytocin because, well, oxytocin is the only one on the list that's not secreted, that's not released from the posterior pituitary. Right? The other ones are all released by the anterior pituitary. Now let's talk about the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland secretes two major hormones. One is the thyroid hormone, and the other is calcitonin. So in the thyroid gland is situated in front of your trachea, okay, on the lower portion of your neck. Okay. In your thyroid gland, there are two major types of cells. One are those follicular cells. Those secrete thyroid hormone. And it's situated next to those follicular cells, there are parafollicular cells. These parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin. Okay. The thyroid hormones secreted by the follicular cells have an effect on the basal metabolic rate. Okay. So it changes your metabolic rate. Calcitonin, as the name implies, okay, you can think of it as it tones down the calcium level. So it's secreted by the parafollicular cells, and then it decreases the blood calcium. Now the parathyroid gland, these glands are situated on the posterior aspect of your thyroid gland. So they're intimately affiliated with your thyroid gland. These glands, you have 4 of them, they secrete parathyroid hormone, PTH. PTH action is in opposition of the calcitonin. Okay, so it's going to act to increase blood calcium. Now let's move on to talking about adrenal gland. Adrenal glands, also known as suprarenal glands, supra is above. Renal is referring to kidney, so it's above the kidney. These are pyramid-shaped glands that are located on top of each kidney. And you can divide the regions into two. There's the adrenal cortex on the outside, and then inside there's adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is really neural tissue, and that's something we're going to talk more about in Unit 5. It's considered part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex, which is something we're going to talk more about today, it forms the bulk of the gland. But all of these adrenal hormones work together to help our body cope with different stresses. As you can see, the adrenal cortex can be divided into three regions. Starting from the most superficial, we have the zona glomerulosa, and then deep to that is zona fasciculata, and then zona reticularis. Okay, so once again, the G, the F, and the R, GFR. Zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. While you're studying this, you should be repeating these terms again and again and again. If you need to pause the video to do that, please do so. Okay. The zona glomerulosa secretes a hormone called aldosterone. This is a hormone that leads to kidney reabsorption of water and salt. So when your body retains more water and salt, it raises your blood pressure. In fact, this hormone, excessive amount of this hormone is going to raise your blood pressure, and you can have hypertension. Okay, so zona fasciculata secretes cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Okay, when you're under stress, more cortisol is released, and it can cause your blood sugar to increase. Okay, zona reticularis secretes this DHEA, which is considered a weak androgen. So it's a weak sex hormone. Okay, well, how do you remember this? Well, you can remember this by the mnemonic device. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. What I mean by that, okay, it's this one causes the absorption of salt and water. So salt, this one causes increased sugar, so sugar. This one is sex hormone, so sex. Salt, sugar, sex. Right? The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. Kind of a dirty mnemonic. Or I shouldn't say mnemonic, it's more of a memory device. Now. Okay. And then once you reach the adrenal medulla, that's neural tissue that's going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. All of these hormones secreted by the adrenal cortex are considered corticosteroids. Pineal gland, moving on to talking about pineal gland. Pineal gland, okay, so we've seen this image from earlier when we talked about pituitary gland. Okay. Your pineal gland is really just on the back beneath your thalamus. Okay. And the anatomy of this is something we're going to study in Unit 5. Okay, there isn't much you have to know about this gland, just that it secretes melatonin. You've all heard about melatonin. It's that hormone that helps you regulate your sleep-wake cycle, or your circadian rhythm. The pancreas is a special organ because it contains both endocrine as well as exocrine cells. The exocrine component secretes digestive enzymes that help you break down whether it's carbohydrate or fat or protein. Okay, so it's very important for that reason. The endocrine cells of your pancreas, okay, there are different endocrine cells. The two major ones we talk about in this class are the alpha cells and beta cells. Your lecture note also mentions the delta cells and the PP cells. The PP cells, it stands for pancreatic polypeptide cells. So those two you don't have to worry about. The alpha cells, they secrete glucagon, which is the hormone that raises your blood sugar. It tells or signals your liver to release glucose storage. Okay. The beta cells in the pancreas, they secrete a hormone called insulin. You've all heard about this insulin. Insulin is a hormone that signals most of your body's tissue cells to take up glucose from the blood, and that in turn is going to help lower your blood sugar. Both of these cells are located in the structures known as pancreatic islet, also known as islet of Langerhans. Okay, so islet of Langerhans they are considered endocrine tissue. You can see these SNR cells are exocrine tissue as they dump their secretion into ducts. Okay, these ducts eventually lead into your digestive tract, and this is something we're going to talk about in I believe, the 4th unit. Okay. Thymus. Your thymus is an endocrine as well as an immune organ. This is the site where your T lymphocytes mature. They undergo their maturation. So T lymphocytes, like all blood cells, they originate from the bone marrow, but then during their development and their maturation, they move to the thymus. That's where they attain their maturation. And this gland is located in the superior mediastinum. So remember that mediastinum is that space between your two lungs. Now the gonads, that means the testes in men and ovaries in women. Okay. And these are the main sources of your sex hormones. In men, their testes have these interstitial cells that secrete the testosterone. And testosterone has importance in regulating the secondary sex characteristics, okay, and also promotes the formation of sperm. So spermatogenesis, something you're going to learn more about in physiology. In females, the gonad is referring to the ovaries. And your ovaries secrete these sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Whereas estrogen is responsible for developing the secondary sex characteristics in female after reaching puberty. Right? Progesterone is important for maintaining the uterine lining in preparation for pregnancy. Some other endocrine organs, or endocrine structures, I should say. Your heart secretes ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay. And that is a hormone that stimulates loss of fluids and salt from your body, whereas placenta during pregnancy, it secretes human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And many women may have heard of this because this is a hormone that gets tested to see whether or not you're pregnant. Okay. And this is a hormone that's also important in sustaining the pregnancy. Now the kidneys secrete renin and erythropoietin, or EPO. Renin is a hormone that plays a role in regulating your blood pressure. Okay. And then erythropoietin, as indicated by its name. Okay, this should remind you of erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. And this is a hormone that gets secreted by kidney and then acts on the bone marrow to cause increased production of red blood cells. Okay, so oftentimes people with chronic kidney disease will have anemia. They will have insufficient red blood cells because you're not able to properly secrete that EPO. Your skin produces vitamin D. It produces an activated form of vitamin D. Okay. And that concludes our lecture.